At some point, most people have noticed that they get sick right after a stressful period ends. The deadline passes, the difficult situation resolves, the tension finally lifts, and within a day or two, a cold appears, or a headache that won't leave, or a stomach that suddenly stops working properly. It feels like bad timing, like the body chose the worst possible moment to fall apart. It is not bad timing. It is biology behaving exactly as it should, just in a way that most people have never had explained to them. Stress does not just feel bad. It does specific, measurable things to your immune system, your cardiovascular system, your digestive tract, your muscles, and your brain chemistry. These are not vague connections or psychosomatic effects. They are documented physiological pathways that researchers have traced in detail over the last several decades. Understanding them changes how you think about stress, not as an emotional experience that happens to make you feel terrible, but as a physical process with physical consequences that follow a predictable pattern. Let's start with the hormone that drives all of it. Cortisol is not a stress hormone in the way the word is usually used, as if it was something the body produces by mistake that should ideally be avoided. Cortisol is essential. It is produced by the adrenal glands in response to a signal from the brain, and it does a remarkable number of useful things. In the short term, cortisol raises blood sugar to make energy available quickly. It sharpens alertness and focus. It suppresses inflammation temporarily so that physical performance is not impaired. It shifts blood flow toward the muscles and brain and away from systems that are not immediately needed, like digestion. It is the biological machinery of the acute stress response, and in the context of genuine short-term threat, it works exactly as intended. The problem is not cortisol. The problem is duration. The acute stress response is designed for situations that resolve a physical threat, an immediate danger, a challenge that ends. The system activates, the threat passes, cortisol drops, the body returns to baseline. That recovery period is not optional. It is the moment when the systems that were suppressed during the stress response come back online and do their maintenance work. When stress is chronic, when the activation never fully resolves, when cortisol remains elevated not for minutes but for hours and days and weeks, the body stays in a state it was only designed to occupy briefly, and the systems that were suppressed to handle a short-term emergency begin to deteriorate from prolonged neglect. This is the mechanism behind every physical symptom that chronic stress produces. The immune system is where the consequences of chronic cortisol elevation are perhaps best documented. In the short term, cortisol has an anti-inflammatory effect. This is useful during acute stress. You don't want your immune system mounting a full inflammatory response while you're trying to handle an emergency. But immune suppression that is helpful for 30 minutes becomes harmful across weeks and months. A landmark study by psychologist Sheldon Cohen and his colleagues at Carnegie Mellon University exposed healthy volunteers to cold viruses and then monitored them for infection. People who reported higher levels of psychological stress were significantly more likely to develop an actual cold. Not just report symptoms, but show measurable viral infection and immune response. The effect was dose-dependent, more stress, higher infection rate, and it was specific to chronic stress rather than acute stress. The duration of the stressful period mattered more than its intensity. The mechanism is direct. Chronically elevated cortisol suppresses the production and function of lymphocytes, the white blood cells that identify and destroy pathogens. It reduces the activity of natural killer cells. It interferes with the signaling between immune cells that coordinates an effective response to infection. The person under chronic stress is not imagining that they get sick more easily. Their immune surveillance has been genuinely compromised by sustained cortisol suppression. This also explains the pattern of getting sick when stress ends. During the stressful period, cortisol kept the immune system suppressed. When the stressor resolves and cortisol drops, the immune system rebounds and simultaneously mounts the response to whatever pathogen it had been holding off. The illness was waiting. The cortisol drop gave it permission to proceed. The cardiovascular system responds to chronic cortisol in ways that accumulate over time into serious risk. In the short term, Cortisol raises heart rate and blood pressure to deliver more oxygen to muscles during an emergency. Useful. In the short term, chronically elevated cortisol keeps blood pressure elevated day after day. The walls of blood vessels are exposed to sustained higher pressure. Over time, this damages the endothelium, the thin layer of cells lining the vessels, contributing to arterial stiffness and the development of atherosclerosis. Cortisol also promotes the deposition of visceral fat, the fat stored around abdominal organs rather than under the skin. Visceral fat is metabolically active in a harmful way. It produces inflammatory signals that further damage blood vessels. It is strongly associated with cardiovascular disease, insulin resistance, and metabolic syndrome. A large cohort study following participants over more than a decade found that people with chronically elevated cortisol, measured through hair cortisol levels, which reflect average exposure over months, had significantly higher rates of cardiovascular events than those with normal cortisol levels, independent of other risk factors. The relationship between chronic stress and heart disease is not metaphorical, it is biochemical and cumulative. The digestive system is exquisitely sensitive to cortisol. And the mechanism here involves one of the most significant discoveries in gut biology of the last 20 years. The gut has its own nervous system, the enteric nervous system, containing approximately 500 million neurons. This system communicates continuously with the brain through what researchers call the gut-brain axis, a bidirectional signaling pathway involving the vagus nerve, the immune system, and the bacteria that inhabit the gastrointestinal tract. Cortisol disrupts this axis in multiple ways. It alters gut motility, the rhythmic contractions that move food through the digestive tract. In some people, this acceleration causes diarrhea. In others, it causes constipation. Both are physiological responses to the same hormonal disruption, varying by individual. More significantly, chronic cortisol exposure increases intestinal permeability, what is sometimes called leaky gut. The tight junctions between intestinal cells that normally prevent large molecules from passing into the bloodstream become less effective. Bacterial products and partially digested food particles cross the gut wall and enter systemic circulation. The immune system responds to these as foreign invaders. Chronic inflammation results. Cortisol also disrupts the composition of the gut microbiome, the community of bacteria, fungi, and other microorganisms that inhabit the digestive tract. Research has shown that chronic stress shifts the microbiome toward compositions associated with increased inflammation, decreased immune function, and altered mood regulation. The gut microbiome produces a significant portion of the body's serotonin, and its disruption under chronic stress contributes to the mood changes and depression that often accompany sustained psychological pressure. This is not psychosomatic. It is a direct biochemical pathway from stress hormone to gut bacteria composition to serotonin availability to mood. The depression or anxiety that accompanies chronic stress is not entirely a psychological response to difficult circumstances. It is partly a physiological consequence of what those circumstances are doing to your gut chemistry. Muscle tissue breaks down under chronic cortisol in a process called catabolism. Cortisol is catabolic by nature. It breaks down stored resources to make energy available quickly. In the short term, this is appropriate. In the long term, sustained catabolism breaks down muscle protein for fuel even when dietary intake is adequate. People under chronic stress often experience muscle weakness, loss of physical capacity, and slower recovery from physical exertion. Not because they are exercising less, but because cortisol is actively degrading muscle tissue faster than it can be rebuilt. Cortisol also interferes with the action of testosterone and growth hormone, both of which are anabolic, meaning they promote muscle building and repair. The suppression of anabolic hormones combined with the promotion of catabolism creates a hormonal environment that erodes physical capacity over time, regardless of effort in the gym. Bone density is also affected. Cortisol inhibits osteoblasts, the cells responsible for building new bone, while promoting the activity of osteoclasts, which break bone down. Chronic stress is a recognized risk factor for reduced bone mineral density over time. Now let's talk about what the research supports in terms of actually changing the cortisol picture. The most consistently effective intervention in the research literature is something that feels too simple to be taken seriously: controlled breathing. Specifically, slow exhalation. The vagus nerve, the longest nerve in the body, running from the brainstem through the chest and abdomen, is the primary pathway of the parasympathetic nervous system, the biological counterpart to the stress response. Stimulating the vagus nerve directly activates the recovery state. Slow, controlled exhalation is one of the most effective ways to stimulate vagal tone. When the exhale is longer than the inhale, heart rate variability increases, which is a measurable indicator of parasympathetic activation. A 2017 study in Frontiers in Psychology found that a breathing pattern of 5 seconds inhale and 5 seconds exhale practiced for just 5 minutes produced significant reductions in cortisol and self-reported stress compared to controls. Military pilots and surgeons use deliberate breathing protocols specifically because the research on their effectiveness is solid enough to justify standardized training. This is not meditation in the popular sense. It is a physiological tool with a documented mechanism. Physical exercise, specifically moderate aerobic exercise, reduces chronic cortisol elevation. The key word is moderate. Intense exercise produces a temporary cortisol spike, which is part of the adaptive training response. But moderate aerobic activity, a 30 to 45-minute walk or jog at a conversational pace, consistently reduces baseline cortisol over time. A meta-analysis of exercise interventions found that regular moderate aerobic exercise was associated with significantly lower resting cortisol levels across multiple populations. Social connection has a more significant biological effect on cortisol than most people expect. Oxytocin, released through positive social interaction, physical contact, and meaningful connection, directly suppresses cortisol. A study at UCLA found that social support during stressful situations measurably reduced cortisol responses compared to facing the same stressor alone. The effect is not small. Isolation under stress is not just emotionally difficult, it removes a biological buffer against cortisol accumulation. Cold water exposure, brief, not prolonged, produces a parasympathetic rebound after the initial stress response. A cold shower or cold water immersion of 2 to 3 minutes activates the acute stress response, which then triggers a compensatory parasympathetic activation afterward. Over time, with regular practice, this trains the system to recover from stress activation more quickly. The research here is less extensive than for breathing and exercise, but the mechanistic logic is sound and the practical accessibility is high. Sleep, again, is not separable from this. Cortisol follows a circadian rhythm. It is highest in the early morning as a natural wake signal and declines through the day. Poor sleep disrupts this pattern, leaving cortisol elevated at times when it should be low, which in turn further disrupts sleep the following night. The cycle compounds. Addressing sleep quality is not separate from addressing chronic stress biology. It is the same intervention from a different angle. Here is the framing that changes how this is usually thought about. Chronic stress is not a mental health issue that occasionally produces physical symptoms. It is a physiological state, a sustained hormonal imbalance, that produces predictable, measurable damage to specific organ systems over time, and that happens to be experienced as psychological distress from the inside. The person who is chronically stressed is not weak or failing to cope. They are running a biological system in a mode it was designed to occupy briefly for months or years at a time. The physical consequences, the immune suppression, the cardiovascular risk, the gut disruption, the muscle breakdown, the mood dysregulation, are not side effects of stress. They are the mechanism of it. Addressing chronic stress means addressing the hormonal state, not just the circumstances, which means sleep, movement, breathing, connection, and reducing the duration of unresolved activation wherever possible. None of these require significant time or expense. All of them have documented mechanisms, and the biology responds faster than most people expect. Cortisol levels shift within days of consistent changes in sleep and exercise, within minutes of slow breathing practice. The body is not passive in this. It responds. You just have to give it something to respond to. If this changed how you think about stress and what it's actually doing to you, hit the like button, share it with someone who has been dismissing their stress as just a mental thing, and subscribe for more